Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
The city outside was shrouded in fog so dense that the gas lamps appeared as faint, trembling stars amid the swirling grey. Holmes sat in his armchair opposite me, his long, lean figure stretched out in repose, yet I knew well that his mind was anything but idle. He had been silent for nearly an hour, his sharp eyes half closed, his fingers steepled together as he stared at the faint curl of smoke rising from his pipe. Suddenly, he spoke without turning his head. "You have been thinking of retirement, Watson," I started. "My dear Holmes, how could you possibly—" "The advertisement in the Lancet, which you circled twice this morning, concerned a small country practice in Surrey. Your handwriting upon the envelope beside you suggests a letter of inquiry. Thus the conclusion is obvious." I laughed despite myself. "You are incorrigible, Holmes. A man can scarcely entertain a passing thought in your company without having it laid bare." He smiled faintly. "It is the curse of observation, my friend. And yet," he leaned forward suddenly, eyes gleaming, "it is also its gift. Tell me, would you still consider leaving London if I promised you one final case, something truly worthy of our talents?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale with unease. In her trembling hands she held a small crumpled note. "It's from a constable, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He says it's urgent." Holmes took the note and read it aloud. A terrible cry was heard from Belgrave Street shortly after midnight. The neighbours report an old woman's voice screaming for help. Upon arrival, the police found her dead, locked inside her own room. No sign of entry or struggle. "Inspector Lestrade requests your immediate assistance." Holmes's eyes sparkled with sudden energy. "Watson, the game begins anew. Fetch your coat, we are bound for Belgrave Street." The fog was so thick that the cabman's lanterns barely pierced it as we rattled through the lamplit streets. The chill bit through our coats and the city seemed unnaturally silent, save for the occasional clang of a distant bell or the muffled hooves of passing carriages. When at last we arrived, the narrow row of houses loomed before us like a wall of ghostly silhouettes. At the centre stood number 17 Belgrave Street, a modest dwelling whose windows glowed faintly with the yellow light of a single gas lamp within. A small crowd of curious onlookers lingered despite the cold, murmuring in low voices. Inspector Lestrade met us at the door, his moustache bristling with both cold and irritation. "Glad you could come, Mr. Holmes. It's a devilish business this time." "Come in, come in." We stepped inside to find a small but tidy sitting room, smelling faintly of lavender and old wood. The body had been removed to an adjoining chamber, but the unease in the air lingered like perfume. The victim's name, Lestrade began, consulting his notebook, was Mrs. Agnes Wilberforce, aged 78. Widowed, living alone, no known enemies. A quiet woman, the neighbours say, though some mention strange noises in the night. "Strange noises?" Holmes asked sharply. "Yes, soft crying, talking to herself, sometimes even laughter. They thought her senile. But last night—" Lestrade shook his head. "At exactly 12 o'clock, a piercing scream woke the entire street. When we broke in, the door was bolted from the inside. She was lying on the floor, dead. Cause of death unknown. No wounds, no sign of struggle." Holmes's gaze wandered slowly around the room. His eyes lingered on the window latch, the hearth and the mantelpiece, upon which rested a small framed photograph of a young girl. Beneath it, a clock had stopped at precisely 12:03. He crouched, studying the floorboards, then turned his attention to a small handbell lying beside the chair. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious indeed." I moved closer. "What do you observe, Holmes?" "Patience, my dear Watson. Every crime speaks, but one must first learn its language." He stood abruptly and turned to Lestrade. "You said she lived alone. Who last saw her alive?" "Her maid, a girl named Clara Finch. She claims she left the house around 9 last night after bringing the old woman her tea. She insists the door was locked when she returned this morning." Holmes nodded slowly. "We must speak with this Clara at once." He glanced once more at the silent clock, the extinguished candle, and the faint smell of burnt paper drifting from the hearth. Then, with that peculiar gleam of anticipation I had seen so many times before, he said softly, "Watson, I have no doubt this cry at midnight was not merely a scream of terror, but a message. The question is, to whom was it sent?" Holmes and I followed Inspector Lestrade into the dimly lit corridor that led to the servants' quarters. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long shadows upon the wallpaper, which was faded and peeling at the edges. The air carried a faint scent of dampness and lavender polish. At the end of the passage sat a young woman upon a small wooden chair, her eyes red and swollen from weeping. She was pale, frail, and clutched a handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles shone white. "This is Clara Finch," said Lestrade. "She's the maid, the only one left in the house since Mrs. Wilberforce's nurse left last month. She found the door bolted this morning and raised the alarm." Holmes regarded her with quiet intensity, his sharp eyes missing nothing, not the trembling of her fingers, nor the faint trace of soot upon her sleeve. He took a seat opposite her, folding his hands neatly upon his knee. "Miss Finch," he began softly, "you need not be afraid. We are only here to understand what occurred. Tell me everything you remember of last night, no matter how trivial it may seem." The girl took a shaky breath. "I brought Mrs. Wilberforce her tea at 9, sir, just as always. She was in her chair by the fire, knitting. She seemed uneasy, though. She asked me twice whether I'd locked the back door. And when I told her I had, she said, 'It's not the doors I fear, child,' but the silence between them." I didn't understand what she meant. Holmes tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And after that? I tidied the kitchen, sir, then went upstairs to my room. I didn't hear anything till this morning, only the wind rattling the panes. When I came down, the front door was locked from inside. I called her name, but there was no answer. Then I fetched the constable. Was the window in her room secured when you entered?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir. Shut tight. She always said she hated drafts." Holmes rose and began pacing slowly. "Tell me, Miss Finch, did your mistress receive any visitors recently? Letters, perhaps?" The maid frowned in thought. "A gentleman came 3 nights ago. I didn't see his face clearly. It was raining hard, and he wore a hat pulled low. He stayed no more than 10 minutes. After he left, Mrs. Wilberforce was trembling something awful. She told me to burn the fire high and not to mention the visitor to anyone." Holmes stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing. "Did you happen to notice if the gentleman left anything behind?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "A small parcel. Mrs. Wilberforce took it straight to her room. The next morning she told me she had locked it in her writing desk." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And this writing desk, where is it now?" "In her chamber, sir. The key is still missing." Holmes turned briskly to Lestrade. "You see, Inspector, we are already surrounded by locks and silence. Let us look at this desk." We returned to the old woman's bedroom, where the air still held a chill that seemed to defy the fire in the grate. The room was orderly, almost unnaturally so. The bed was neatly made, a pair of spectacles rested upon the nightstand, and a wool shawl lay folded across the chair where, according to Clara, the old woman had spent her last evening alive. In the corner stood a mahogany writing desk with brass fittings. Holmes examined the keyhole, then took a slender instrument from his pocket and, after a few deft turns, the lock yielded with a soft click. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Holmes opened it with meticulous care. Within was a child's silver rattle, tarnished yet still gleaming faintly beneath the light. "A curious keepsake," I remarked. "Curious indeed," said Holmes. "Note the inscription, 'To Clara with love from Mother.'" Clara, who had followed us into the room, gasped audibly. "But that's my name." Holmes turned to her sharply. "Your name? Then you were acquainted with Mrs. Wilberforce's family?" The girl shook her head in confusion. "No, sir. I came from the orphanage in Kensington. Mrs. Wilberforce hired me through the agency 3 months ago. She never said anything about knowing me before." Holmes looked back at the rattle, his brow furrowed in thought. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe how the inscription is worn, years old, not recent. Yet the name, the connection, the timing, it is no coincidence." Lestrade grunted skeptically. "A child's toy proves nothing, Holmes. Old women keep all manner of trinkets. Perhaps she bought it at a market." Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she recognized something in her maid that she dared not speak of." He turned the rattle over in his hand, studying a small patch of discoloration upon the handle. "Do you see this darkened spot? Silver tarnishes unevenly, unless exposed to certain chemicals. I would wager that this rattle has been handled recently, and by someone anxious." Clara clasped her hands together. "Sir, I swear I've never seen it before tonight. Holmes gave her a gentle nod. "I believe you, Miss Finch. Fear often speaks louder than deceit." He turned toward the hearth, where a small pile of half-burned paper still smouldered faintly in the grate. Using the poker, he teased out a fragment large enough to reveal part of a sentence. "Cannot forgive myself for what was done to the child." Watson, ever the man of conscience, felt a chill pass through him. "Holmes, this is no ordinary death. There is guilt here, old festering guilt." Holmes replaced the poker and stood in silence for a moment, his keen eyes darting from the photograph on the mantelpiece to the stopped clock beside it. "The photograph," he said suddenly. "Watson, hand it to me." It was a faded image of a young woman with soft features, holding a small infant. On the back in neat handwriting were the words Clara, My Light in the Dark, 1859. The maid took a step back, her face ashen. "That's my name again. But I wasn't even born then." Holmes placed the photograph gently upon the table. "No, but the resemblance is remarkable. I would say that Mrs. Wilberforce once had a daughter named Clara, a child who, by all accounts, would now be about your age, had she lived." Lestrade frowned. "And what of that? What's it to do with the cry last night?" Holmes moved to the window, his silhouette stark against the dim light outside. "Everything, Inspector. The dead rarely cry out in fear. They cry out in remembrance. The hour of death, the stopped clock, the forgotten name, all point to a reckoning long delayed." He turned back, his eyes gleaming with the spark of revelation. "This house hides 2 generations of secrets. And I fancy that if we find the truth of one Clara Wilberforce, we shall uncover the death of another." As he spoke, a knock echoed from below, 3 sharp raps against the front door. Lestrade started toward the stairs, but Holmes held up a hand. "No, Inspector, allow me. Whoever calls at this hour may hold the missing piece of our puzzle." He strode from the room, his coat flaring behind him like a shadow. I followed close, my mind racing with questions. When the door opened, the fog curled inward, and there stood a stooped old man, his beard white as frost, his hat dripping with mist. "I've come," the stranger said in a trembling voice, "because I heard she's dead, and because she once told me that if ever she cried out at midnight, it would mean the past had come for her." Holmes regarded him intently. "And who, sir, might you be?" The old man looked up, his eyes haunted. "Her brother," he whispered. "The one she betrayed." The silence that followed the old man's words seemed to thicken the air around us. Even Lestrade, never one to be moved by drama, shifted uneasily on his feet. Holmes, however, regarded the newcomer with the calm, razor-edged curiosity of a man dissecting a puzzle, piece by piece. "Her brother," Holmes repeated softly. "Then you must be Mr. Arthur Hensley." The old man's eyes widened. How could you know my name?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The label inside your hatband bears the initials AH, and the postal tag on your umbrella, still damp, reads Hensley & Co. Eastbourne. That, combined with the familiarity with which you spoke of the deceased, leaves little room for doubt." Arthur Hensley gave a weak, almost defeated nod. "Yes, I am Arthur. Agnes and I were all that was left of our family, though we'd not spoken in near 20 years. His voice trembled with the weight of memory. "I came tonight because I dreamed of her scream before the constable ever reached me. It was as if I heard her calling from across the years." Holmes motioned for him to enter, closing the door against the biting fog. "You had better sit, Mr. Hensley. There is much we must ask you, and your account may prove crucial." The old man settled into a chair beside the hearth, his gnarled hands trembling as he held them toward the flame. I noticed how his coat sleeves were frayed, his shoes thin at the soles, a man worn by time and remorse. "I had not seen her since our quarrel," he said slowly. "It was about her daughter, Clara, my niece. Agnes had married a sailor. Wilberforce was his name, and when he died she grew strange. She claimed to hear his voice in the house, said the sea called to her in her dreams. Then one day the child vanished. Only a few years old she was. Gone without a trace. The police said she drowned in the river near the docks. I accused Agnes of neglect. She swore I'd cursed her. After that she shut herself away." At the mention of the lost child, Clara Finch drew in a sharp breath. Holmes glanced at her quickly but said nothing. "Did your sister ever speak to you again?" I asked. "Never, until last week," his voice lowered. "I received a letter, no signature, but I knew her hand. It said only, 'If the past still haunts you, come before it takes me, too.' Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glittering in the firelight. "And yet you came only tonight." Hensley hesitated. "I meant to come sooner, but I fell ill. When I finally gathered the strength, it was too late." He looked up suddenly, anguish twisting his face. "You must believe me, sir. I never wished her harm." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then rose and began pacing the room. "You say the child vanished near the river. Were there any signs, a toy, a garment, anything recovered?" "Only her silver rattle," Hensley murmured. "The constable brought it to Agnes days later. She wouldn't let it out of her sight afterward." Holmes stopped mid-stride, his back to us. "That same rattle," he said softly, "now lies in the desk where she met her end." The old man's head jerked up, confusion clouding his eyes. "Then you've seen it. My God. She must have kept it all these years." Holmes turned, and for a fleeting instant I thought I saw something like pity in his face. "Yes, Mr. Hensley. And it seems that her final hours were spent surrounded by the relics of that long-buried sorrow." Lestrade, growing impatient, cleared his throat. "Forgive me, Mr. Holmes, but all this talk of ghosts and guilt won't tell us how the woman died. There's no wound, no poison, no sign of violence. The doctor said it looked like her heart simply stopped." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A convenient diagnosis, Inspector, but hardly an explanation. A sudden cardiac arrest may mask a far more deliberate cause." He turned to Clara Finch. "Miss Finch, when you brought your mistress her tea last night, did you drink from the same pot?" The girl blinked, startled. "No, sir. She always took her tea alone." "Of course she did," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to us. "And she died within 3 hours of drinking it. Tell me, Lestrade, has the teapot been examined?" The inspector shook his head. "We've sealed the kitchen but found nothing suspicious." "Then you overlooked the obvious," Holmes said briskly. "Watson, if you would join me downstairs." We descended into the small, narrow kitchen, where the faint smell of burnt oil still lingered. Holmes examined the table, the kettle, and the teacup resting upon the tray. He held the cup beneath the light and pointed to a faint discoloration along the rim. "Note the dull, chalky residue," he said. "A common enough substance when mixed with laudanum, but in sufficient quantity, it slows the heart until death appears natural. The question is, did Mrs. Wilberforce prepare her own tea, or did someone assist her?" "Miss Finch brought it," I said, uneasy. Holmes nodded absently, deep in thought. "Yes, and she seems sincere in her ignorance, which means either the poison was introduced earlier, or the cup was replaced." He inspected the shelf above the sink, then the small cupboard near the window. "There are 2 identical cups here," he murmured. "One is spotless, the other faintly tarnished by residue. A subtle exchange, easily done if one wished to mask their intent." We returned to the sitting room where the others waited. Holmes's expression was unreadable as he addressed the inspector. "Lestrade, have your men checked for any trace of laudanum in the teapot? It is a tincture readily available in most chemists, often used to soothe nervous complaints." Lestrade scribbled the note reluctantly. "And if you're right, who'd have wanted her dead?" "Ah," Holmes said, his eyes flickering toward the maid and the old man. "That, Inspector, is precisely the question." Clara Finch was trembling, her gaze fixed on the rattle still resting upon the desk. "I swear I didn't harm her. She was kind to me, even when she grew strange. Sometimes she'd call me my little Clara and weep for no reason." Mr. Hensley looked at her sharply, something dawning in his eyes. She called you Clara?" "Yes, sir." The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. "And you came from an orphanage, you said?" She nodded, hesitant. "From Kensington, sir. I don't remember my parents. They said I was found by the river when I was a baby." A sound escaped Hensley's throat, half gasp, half sob. Holmes stepped closer, his expression grave. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe we are standing amid the final act of a tragedy that began more than 20 years ago." He faced the maid. "Miss Finch, it may shock you to learn that the child who vanished from this very family, the daughter of Agnes Wilberforce, was also named Clara." The girl stared at him in disbelief. "You mean I—" Holmes raised a hand gently. "I do not yet claim certainty. But your age, your name, your origin by the river, it is a pattern too precise for chance. If this is true, then the woman who died upstairs was not merely your employer, she was your mother." The words hung in the air like the toll of a bell. Clara sank into the chair, her face buried in her hands. Lestrade muttered an oath under his breath. Arthur Hensley covered his face, his shoulders shaking. "God forgive her," he whispered. All these years hiding her own child in plain sight. Holmes stood silent for several moments, then spoke with quiet gravity. It would seem Mrs. Wilberforce's final hours were spent in reckoning with her guilt. The cry we heard of at midnight was not one of fear, but of recognition. I suspect she realized too late that her sin had come home to her in the form of her own servant. He turned to the window, gazing into the thick fog beyond. But one mystery remains. If remorse alone killed her, why the poison? Who sought to ensure she would not live to confess? As if in answer, the wind rose outside, rattling the panes like skeletal fingers. Holmes did not move. "Watson," he said softly, "there is another hand at work in this tragedy, and I mean to uncover it before the night is out." Holmes remained by the window for a long while, the faint orange glow of the street lamps cutting through the fog and casting long quivering shadows across the room. His reflection appeared spectral in the glass, his lean features drawn in sharp thought. The silence within the chamber was heavy, broken only by Clara's quiet sobs and the creak of the old floorboards as the house seemed to shift with the cold. At last, Holmes turned toward us, his expression calm but his eyes bright with calculation. "There is a design here," he said, almost to himself. "Guilt, deception, and an unseen hand guiding the final act. The poison, Watson, is not the work of remorse. It is the signature of interference." Lestrade snorted, though there was unease behind his bluster. "Interference? You think someone else slipped the stuff into her tea? Who would have had the chance?" Holmes's tone remained measured. "That, Inspector, is what we must determine. Opportunity often hides in routine. Miss Finch prepares the tea, yet the preparation itself may have been tampered with before it reached her hands." He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, examining the small tray still on the table. "Tell me, Miss Finch, where do you keep the tea leaves?" "In the tin by the pantry window, sir," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "Was it locked?" "No, sir. It never is," Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then anyone with access to the house could have placed a substance within it, an act so simple that it would pass unnoticed until far too late." Arthur Hensley raised his weary head. "But who would wish her harm? Agnes had no friends left, and her enemies were long in the grave." Holmes gave him a long, unreadable look. "The dead, Mr. Hensley, rarely stay buried in spirit. But I refer not to ghosts, only to the echoes of their deeds." He crouched near the fireplace again, examining the half-burned fragments that had so intrigued him earlier. "Here lies the motive, I believe," he murmured. "Watson, help me with this poker, carefully, mind you." We lifted several pieces of the charred paper from the grate and spread them across the small side table. Some were reduced to blackened curls, but others bore faint lines of ink, the words fractured but legible in parts. Holmes bent low, his sharp eyes tracing each fragment like a code. "Observe," he said quietly, piecing the scraps together. "Forgive myself, child. Truth will out. He knows what I did." He straightened suddenly, the intensity in his gaze rekindled. "Watson, this was not a letter of confession, it was a plea. Someone was threatening her." Lestrade frowned. "Threatening an old woman? To what end?" Holmes gestured toward the photograph of the young mother and child upon the mantel. "To ensure that whatever she had hidden remained so. Perhaps the truth of the child's disappearance was not what the records claimed. Perhaps someone else bore guilt, someone still living and afraid the past might speak again." Clara's voice quavered through the stillness. "But who could that be, sir?" "There was no one but her and me." Holmes regarded her gravely. "Oh, forget, Miss Finch. There was also the man who visited 3 nights ago. The one your mistress forbade you to mention." Her eyes widened with dawning fear. "Yes, the man in the hat. But I never saw his face." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "And yet he came unannounced at night and left her shaken. It was the spark that lit the fuse. Mr. Hensley, do you know of any such acquaintance?" The old man shook his head slowly. "No, but Agnes once mentioned a solicitor, a Mr. Graves, who helped her manage what little money she had left. She distrusted him, said he was too eager to know her affairs." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Mr. Graves, you say? An apt name for a man who buries secrets. Lestrade, make inquiries at once. Have a runner sent to obtain this man's address. Meanwhile, we shall inspect the rest of this house. There may be something yet unseen that speaks louder than words." While Lestrade muttered instructions to the constable stationed at the door, Holmes lit a small lamp and motioned for me to follow. We ascended the narrow staircase, our footsteps echoing faintly through the stillness. The upper floor smelled faintly of dust and lavender, untouched save for the room of the deceased. Holmes examined each door in turn. Most stood ajar, their contents sparse and unremarkable. But when he reached the end of the corridor, he paused before a narrow door half hidden by a draped curtain. "This one," he murmured. "Locked, of course." He extracted a small instrument from his coat pocket, and with a few deft movements the latch yielded. Inside was a small storage room, lined with crates and forgotten furnishings. Yet Holmes's eyes went immediately to a trunk in the corner, its lid bound by a single frayed cord. He knelt beside it, cutting through the cord with his penknife. Within, wrapped in yellowing paper, lay a collection of letters bound together by ribbon. Holmes picked one at random, unfolding it carefully. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Agnes Wilberforce's. "Listen to this, Watson," he said softly. "He says the child must never be found, that if the truth were known it would destroy us both. He calls it an act of mercy, but I cannot sleep. The river still calls her name." A chill crept down my spine. "So she was complicit," I murmured. "She knew what happened." Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, but not alone." This he, whoever he was, commanded her silence. "That man, I believe, is our murderer." We returned to the sitting room, where Lestrade awaited us with a grim expression. "We found your Mr. Graves," he said. "Lives not far from here, though the runner says he left his home in a hurry about an hour ago. No sign of where he went." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Then he knows the game is up. Watson, Lestrade, we must move quickly." He turned to Clara, whose tear-streaked face had grown pale. "Miss Finch, you must remain here under police watch. No one is to enter this house until we return. Do I make myself clear?" She nodded silently, her hands clasped tightly together. Within minutes we were in a cab once more, the horses' hooves clattering over the slick cobblestones. The fog pressed close around us, swallowing sound and distance alike. Holmes sat forward, his keen profile outlined against the lamplight. "Watson," he said quietly, "you recall the teacup's residue. Laudanum leaves a bitter trace. It would not go unnoticed unless the victim were already accustomed to its taste. Mrs. Wilberforce suffered from nerves, as Lestrade said. She may have taken it nightly in small doses. Thus her killer needed only to increase the measure by degrees. You believe Graves supplied it?" "Precisely. As her solicitor, he would have access to her prescriptions, her affairs, perhaps even her fears. And when she sought to confess, he silenced her before she could expose the truth. The cry at midnight, Watson, was the sound of a conscience stifled one final time. The cab lurched to a halt outside a tall, narrow building off Highgate Road. Its windows were dark, save for a single faint glow on the upper floor. Holmes alighted silently, signaling me to follow. We crept up the steps and Holmes tested the door. It gave way under his hand. It had not been locked. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp paper and dust. Legal documents were strewn across a desk, and a lamp burned low beside a half-packed valise. But the room's occupant sat slumped in the chair, head bowed forward, motionless. Holmes stepped closer, his hand rising briefly to the man's neck. He withdrew it at once, his face grim. "Too late, Watson. Mr. Graves will answer no questions. He's taken his own dose of the same poison." On the desk lay a folded letter addressed to the police. Holmes unfolded it and read in silence, his expression hardening with each line. At last he handed it to me. The words were few but damning. I did what she asked me to do 20 years ago, and what she begged me never to reveal. But when she said she would confess, I could not allow it. The child lived, though she was never meant to. May God forgive me. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the glass. "Watson," he said quietly, "the circle is complete. The truth she feared has come full round, and it has destroyed them both." He turned away, his voice low and somber. "Come, my friend. There remains but one task, to tell the living what the dead have already confessed." We returned to Baker Street just before dawn, the first grey light of morning, filtering through the haze above London's rooftops. The cab's wheels splashed through puddles, the horses steaming in the cold air, and the whole city seemed half asleep, as though unwilling to wake to the weight of the secrets that night had uncovered. Holmes was silent throughout the journey, his gaze fixed upon the shifting fog outside. I could tell that his mind was far from finished with the matter. Though to Lestrade the case might have appeared closed with Mr. Graves's death. When we reached our rooms, Holmes threw off his coat and collapsed into his armchair, with an air of profound weariness. The morning papers lay scattered across the table, the headlines shouting of politics and trivial scandals. He regarded them with faint contempt before reaching for his pipe. The first curl of smoke drifted upward as he finally spoke. "You observed, Watson," he said quietly, "that the letter in Graves's possession seemed a confession. Yet it answered too little and explained too neatly. A suicide note that absolves the writer is almost always written for another's benefit." "You mean to suggest that Graves was protecting someone?" I asked. Holmes inclined his head. "I do. His wording, 'The child lived, though she was never meant to,' implies a living witness to the events of 20 years past, a witness who may yet walk among us." I frowned. "You believe the child still exists, after all this time?" "Not merely believe, Watson. Know. If Mrs. Wilberforce's torment was indeed born of guilt, it would not be for a sin imagined, but for a secret preserved. She was being watched, coerced perhaps, to maintain her silence. Graves's death was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of the final act." He rose suddenly, pacing before the fireplace. "Consider the sequence. A late-night visitor 3 days before the death, followed by a cry at midnight and a carefully administered dose of poison. It was executed with precision, not passion. Graves had motive but no longer opportunity. He was too closely watched. Someone else acted for him. Someone connected to both him and the old woman," I murmured. "Precisely." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark. "And where there is inheritance or property at stake, motive grows fertile. We must look to the will, Watson. The will and those who benefited from it." By midday, Holmes had already dispatched a telegram to the Registrar of Wills and obtained a copy of Mrs. Wilberforce's final testament. When he spread it across the table, the results were curious indeed. "To Miss Clara Finch," Holmes read aloud, "the sum of £200 to be paid from the remaining estate, along with household effects. To Arthur Hensley, the servant of many years, the modest annuity of £40 per annum, and," here he paused, his voice lowering, "the remainder of her assets to be held in trust by her solicitor, Mr. Graves, for the benefit of one Eleanor M., whereabouts unknown." "Eleanor M.," I repeated. "Could that be the child?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Undoubtedly. The initial is deliberate, meant to obscure her identity, but not from Graves. He knew precisely who she was." He tapped the paper. "Watson, I dare say our Eleanor is alive and very likely much closer than anyone suspects." Before I could inquire further, a brisk knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, looking slightly disheveled but triumphant. "Holmes," he said, brandishing a small envelope, "thought you'd like to see this. It was found at Graves's offices this morning, hidden under a drawer, addressed to your Miss Finch." Holmes took it with careful fingers, examining the seal. Unbroken. Curious. He slit it open, spreading the note flat upon the table. The handwriting matched that of Graves. "My dear Miss Finch, you will forgive the lateness of this warning, but your mistress's conscience grows restless. She speaks of confessions that would undo us all. I beg you to remain loyal to the memory of what was agreed. If the past should rise again, remember that silence is your greatest kindness. Do not betray what you are." Holmes's eyes narrowed on the final line. "Do not betray what you are," he repeated softly. "Watson, do you see it?" I shook my head, puzzled. "The wording is odd, yes, but—" "It is the key," he interrupted. "The letter is not an appeal to a servant. It is a warning to a participant. Graves was not addressing her as a bystander, but as one bound to the secret itself. Do not betray what you are, meaning what she truly is." "You can't mean—" I began. "I do." Holmes turned sharply toward me. "Clara Finch is Eleanor M., the lost child." The revelation struck me with full force. It explained her peculiar devotion, her fear, her hesitation in speaking of the past. She had not merely served Mrs. Wilberforce, she had lived under the same roof as her own mother, unaware perhaps at first, but bound by some later revelation too dreadful to share. Holmes snatched up his hat and coat. "Lestrade, come with us." "Watson, you as well. If I am right, Miss Finch is in grave danger. The hand that killed her mother may not yet be finished with its work." We reached the Wilberforce house just as the evening shadows lengthened across the street. The constable at the door greeted us nervously. "Miss Finch has been in her room all day, sir. Won't come out." Holmes ascended the stairs without a word and knocked once. "Miss Finch?" "It is Sherlock Holmes." There was a pause, then the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened, a few inches, and Clara's pale face appeared, her eyes red from crying. "I thought it was over," she whispered. "I fear it is not," Holmes said gently, stepping inside. "You received a letter from Mr. Graves?" Her expression crumpled. "Yes, I burned it. I didn't want to remember." Holmes nodded. "You are Eleanor, are you not? The child who was lost." For a moment she said nothing, then her voice scarcely more than a breath. "Yes." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "But how could she not know?" Holmes answered for her. "She was raised as a ward, told her mother had died. Mrs. Wilberforce was consumed by guilt and brought her here under another name. Graves alone knew the truth, and he used it to keep them both under his control." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He said if I spoke I'd be ruined, that my mother had done something terrible." "I never knew what." Holmes's gaze softened slightly. "And she died protecting you, but tell me, Miss Finch, did anyone else know? Anyone outside the house?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Arthur Hensley. He overheard them once, years ago. I think he guessed." At that moment a faint creak came from the hallway outside. Holmes's head snapped toward the sound. He crossed the floor in 2 strides and flung open the door. There stood Arthur Hensley, his weathered face ghostly in the lamplight, a small pistol trembling in his hand. "She was never meant to live," he rasped. "You don't understand. If the truth came out, it would destroy everything." Holmes raised a steady hand. "Put it down, Mr. Hensley. The truth is already out. Mrs. Wilberforce has paid for her sin. You would not add murder to your conscience." But Hensley's eyes were wild. "She was my sister's child. She killed her own father. Don't you see? It was an accident, but it ruined us all. I had to keep it buried." Before Lestrade could move, Holmes lunged forward, knocking the pistol from his grasp. It clattered across the floor as Hensley collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara shrank back against the wall, her face ashen. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, see to Miss Finch. Lestrade, take him into custody. The last shadow of this tragedy has fallen." As we led Clara downstairs, she clutched Holmes's sleeve. "Was it all my fault?" she whispered. Holmes looked at her gravely, then shook his head. "No, my dear, the fault was never yours. You were the truth they feared, and truth is the one thing they could not bury forever." Outside the fog had lifted, and the first stars glimmered faintly over Baker Street as we made our way home. Holmes walked in silence, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. At last, he murmured, "A strange case, Watson, where guilt spanned generations and silence became a weapon. Yet in the end, even silence yields to truth." And with that he fell silent once more, the echo of his words mingling with the distant toll of midnight bells. The following morning, I found Holmes seated at the window, the pale light of dawn casting sharp angles across his face. His violin rested idly upon the table beside him, untouched for once. He seemed lost in contemplation, eyes distant as if gazing beyond the London skyline into some invisible realm of deduction. A thin trail of smoke curled upward from his pipe, dispersing slowly toward the ceiling. He did not stir as I entered, but spoke without turning his head. "Watson, it is a curious thing how truth, once unearthed, seldom rests. One believes the case resolved, yet the ripples of guilt and consequence extend far beyond the crime itself." I poured myself a cup of tea and took the chair opposite him. "You refer to Miss Finch, no doubt," I said quietly. "She has endured enough to fill a lifetime of sorrow." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and yet her suffering may not be at an end. I have reason to believe that last night's events were not the final chapter of this business." I frowned, but Hensley's confession was clear. He admitted to concealing the truth of the accident and to his attempt on Miss Finch's life. "What remains?" Holmes finally turned toward me, his expression grave. Motive, Watson. Men seldom act without it. What was Hensley's gain in silencing the girl now, after all these years? He had nothing to inherit, no secret left to protect, unless, of course, the accident he spoke of was no accident at all. Before I could respond, a sharp knock resounded from the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, her brow furrowed. "From Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes. Urgent," he said. Holmes took it and scanned the contents swiftly. His eyes narrowed. Ah, as I feared. He passed it to me. Hensley dead. Died in cell at dawn. No signs of struggle. Doctor suspects poison. Request your immediate presence. I looked up in alarm. Poison? But how? He was under guard. Precisely, said Holmes, already reaching for his coat. Which means someone reached him despite it. Come, Watson. There is more to this web than mere guilt and coincidence. The morning streets of London were grey and slick with rain as we made our way to the police station. Lestrade awaited us at the entrance, his usual gruff demeanour replaced by something darker, an unease that even his years in Scotland Yard could not conceal. He was found less than an hour ago, Lestrade said grimly as he led us down a narrow corridor. No struggle, no sign of forced entry. The night constable swears no one approached the cell. Holmes's eyes flicked to the iron bars as we entered the small chamber. Hensley lay upon the narrow cot, his features peaceful yet waxen, his lips tinged faintly blue. Holmes leaned closer, examining the man's fingers, then his throat. A bitter almond scent, Watson, he said softly. Cyanide beyond doubt. But the delivery, that is the puzzle. He gestured toward a tin cup upon the floor. The water, Lestrade, where was it obtained? Standard supply, same as the other cells, the inspector replied. No one touched it after the evening rounds. Holmes lifted the cup to his nose, then replaced it with a faint smile of satisfaction. It was not the water. Look closer at the rim. I followed his gesture. A faint residue clung to the metal edge, shimmering slightly under the lamplight. Some kind of powder? I asked. Precisely. A thin layer of potassium cyanide dust, likely applied with a brush. The question then is who had opportunity to deliver it. Lestrade frowned. No visitors since his arrest. Only the morning rounds. Then we must examine the rounds themselves, Holmes said sharply. Every man who entered this corridor, every object handed to the prisoner. Even the smallest oversight may conceal the truth. As Lestrade hurried off to summon his men, Holmes paced the small cell, lost in thought. You see, Watson, Hensley's death serves a very distinct purpose. The dead do not contradict stories told in their name. Someone feared that he might speak again. Someone who understood that his version of events could unravel their own. You believe there is another hand behind both deaths? I am certain of it, Holmes replied. Hensley silenced Mrs. Wilberforce, but he did not act alone. The coordination, the timing, the means, all suggest a guiding intelligence, one that remained unseen until now. When Lestrade returned, he was accompanied by a nervous-looking young constable who shifted uneasily under Holmes's scrutiny. This man, said Lestrade, was on duty last night. He swears he brought no food or drink to the prisoner, only unlocked the door for the doctor's evening visit. Doctor? Holmes repeated sharply. What doctor? The prison physician, Dr. Partridge. He claimed to have orders from headquarters to examine the prisoner for signs of distress. Showed all the proper papers. Holmes's expression turned cold. Dr. Partridge, he said slowly. A name I do not recall among the Yard's usual medical men. Lestrade looked uneasy. You think the papers were forged? I think, Holmes replied, that your doctor was no doctor at all. Within the hour, a telegraph from headquarters confirmed Holmes's suspicion. No physician named Partridge had been dispatched to the station. The signature on the documents was a forgery, expertly done. Whoever the impostor was, he had entered and left without raising suspicion. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, save for a few muttered phrases. Poison, a substitution, inheritance, always the inheritance. When we arrived, he immediately took to his files, rifling through folders with intense purpose. At last he withdrew a small notebook and laid it open before me. Inside was a clipping from an old newspaper, dated nearly 20 years prior. Read it, he said simply. Tragic accident in Kensington. Wealthy merchant Henry Marlowe dies in domestic incident. Leaves behind widow and infant daughter. Estate in dispute, Marlowe, I read aloud. The initial in the will, Eleanor M. Holmes, you mean to say, precisely, he interrupted. Eleanor Marlowe. Mrs. Wilberforce was once Mrs. Marlowe, widow of Henry Marlowe, whose fortune vanished after his sudden death. She remarried under another name, taking her daughter with her. But the man who forged those documents, who manipulated the will, he has now resurfaced. Graves, I said, not Graves. He was but the pawn. The true architect was the solicitor's partner, Charles Denham, long presumed dead, but whose skill in forgery and deception was unmatched. He vanished after the Marlowe scandal, taking with him the missing half of the estate's papers. Then he has returned to reclaim what was lost. Holmes's eyes gleamed. More than that, Watson. He has returned to erase anyone who might reveal the truth. Hensley, Wilberforce, they were stepping stones. Clara Finch is his final obstacle. I felt a chill run down my spine. Then she is in danger still. Holmes rose, already reaching for his hat. Grave danger, my dear Watson. And unless we find Denham before nightfall, the cry of the old woman will not be the last heard in that house. Without another word, he strode toward the door, his coat flaring behind him like a dark wing. I followed close, heart pounding. As we vanished once more into the fog that awaited beyond Baker Street, back into the mystery that refused to rest, the cab rattled through the narrow London streets as dusk settled over the city, a thick veil of fog rising once more from the Thames. Holmes sat rigid, his sharp features carved in the dim light like a statue of relentless focus. I had grown accustomed to his silences, but there was something in his stillness tonight, an almost feverish intensity, as if every fragment of his mind was spinning toward a single, inexorable point. Holmes, I said at last, breaking the oppressive quiet. You are certain Denham is alive? After all these years? He did not look at me, but his voice was steady, clipped. As certain as I am that he killed Hensley. No other could have orchestrated so precise a death under watch. Denham's methods were always meticulous. Cold poison and forged papers were his instruments long before we ever knew his name. And Clara? I asked. If she is indeed his final target, why wait? He could have taken her at any point. Holmes turned then, his eyes glinting beneath the brim of his hat. Because, Watson, Denham is not a man who kills without ceremony. He seeks closure, not blood. Each death thus far, Mrs. Wilberforce, Graves, Hensley, has been a silencing of the past. The last voice left to silence is not simply Clara Finch. It is Eleanor Marlowe, the rightful heir to the fortune he stole. I felt a chill despite the closeness of the cab. Then we must reach her at once. Holmes tapped his cane impatiently against the floorboards. We shall, if fortune still favors reason. Lestrade's men are watching her lodgings, but Denham is clever. He will not approach as himself. He will come as one trusted, or as one who cannot be refused. The carriage drew up before the Wilberforce residence. The gas lamps burned weakly against the gathering mist, the windows dark save for a faint light in the upstairs room, where Clara had been staying under police supervision. A constable stood by the gate, stamping his feet for warmth. Holmes stepped down swiftly. Any disturbances? None, sir, the constable replied. The lady's been quiet all evening. Holmes nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the opposite side of the street where a shadow lingered, too still, too patient. Watson, he murmured, remain here. He crossed the street in silence, his footfalls barely stirring the gravel, but as he approached, the figure turned suddenly and vanished into the fog. Holmes gave chase, darting around the corner and down a narrow alleyway. I followed as best I could, but the fog thickened, swallowing the lamplight. When I reached him, he stood at the end of the passage, breathing hard, his expression grim. He slipped away, Holmes said, but he was watching the house. Make no mistake. He knows she is here. We returned to the residence without another word. Inside, Clara sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The faint glow cast deep shadows across her face, and the lines of grief seemed to age her beyond her years. When she saw Holmes, she rose anxiously. "You've found him?" she asked. "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But we will. Tell me, Miss Finch, has anyone visited you since the inspector's men were stationed outside?" She shook her head. "Only a message delivered earlier, a note from the solicitor's office. They said it concerned my inheritance. I did not open it. I was afraid." Holmes extended his hand. Give it to me." She fetched the envelope from the table. It was sealed with dark wax, the stamp bearing no crest, only an unfamiliar mark, like the letter D woven into an ornate knot. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the note. "Miss Finch, your claim upon the estate requires confirmation in person. Attend at once 19 Bellamy Street at 9 o'clock this evening. Bring no escort. Matters of discretion demand privacy." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Clever devil," he muttered. "He knows the police watch the house. He tempts her with her name, her inheritance, knowing curiosity and desperation are his greatest allies." Lestrade, who had joined us moments later, frowned. "Bellamy Street, you say? That's near the river warehouses. A grim place for business." "Precisely," said Holmes, "and precisely why we shall go there. But not as expected." He turned to Clara. "You must remain here under guard. No one under any circumstances must enter this house until I return." "Is that understood?" She nodded, though fear clouded her eyes. "But if he means to find me—" "He will," Holmes said softly. "But he will not find what he expects." 2 hours later, as the clock neared 9, Holmes and I made our way to Bellamy Street. The fog had grown thicker still, clinging to the damp brick walls and curling in ghostly tendrils above the gaslights. The address led us to a warehouse long since abandoned, its windows shattered, its door half rotten with decay. A single lantern burned faintly within. Holmes motioned for silence as we slipped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet. Shadows shifted against the far wall, and a voice, a smooth, low voice, spoke from the gloom. "You are punctual, Miss Finch." Holmes straightened, his voice calm but firm. "Your information is outdated, Mr. Denham." There was a pause. Then slow laughter echoed through the dark. "Sherlock Holmes, I wondered how long it would take you to find me." The lantern's light brightened slightly, revealing a tall man in a long coat, his hair silvered, his face lean but composed. His eyes, sharp and cold, glinted like polished steel. Holmes took a step forward. "You have orchestrated 3 deaths and an attempt at a 4th. You have poisoned an innocent man, deceived a family, and forged your way through a lifetime of theft. It ends tonight." Denham smiled faintly. "Ends? Oh no, mister." "Holmes, it merely concludes. Mrs. Wilberforce's guilt demanded her silence. Graves's cowardice invited his own end. Hensley was weak, and weakness poisons truth. I only ensured it died cleanly." "You call murder clean?" I exclaimed. He turned his gaze upon me. "Dr. Watson, is it murder to erase corruption? I merely corrected the past's mistakes. The Marlowe fortune was mine by right, by intellect if not by blood. You of all people should admire that, Holmes." Holmes's tone was icy. "You mistake intellect for license. Justice is not a matter of cleverness." "Justice?" Denham scoffed. "And what is justice to a man like you, one who builds his name upon the ruin of others? You and I are not so different, both observers, both judges. Only I act without pretense." Holmes's eyes flicked toward the shadows. I followed his gaze and saw a faint movement, another figure lurking behind a crate. Holmes's voice lowered slightly. "You have brought company, I see. Insurance, no doubt." "Merely necessity," Denham said smoothly. "You see, Holmes, I cannot afford to leave this city without a final assurance. The girl must die, else everything unravels. But take comfort. Her death will be gentle. You, however—" Holmes raised a hand suddenly. "Enough talk." In one motion, he drew a revolver from his coat and fired, not at Denham but at the lantern above. The glass shattered, plunging the room into darkness. A cry rang out, followed by the sound of a struggle. I lunged forward, blindly hearing footsteps, a scuffle, and then the echo of a body striking the floor. When light returned, Holmes striking a match to the remnants of the lantern, Denham lay bound, his accomplice unconscious beside him. Holmes straightened, his voice calm once more. "You see, Watson, deceit thrives in darkness. Best, then, that we meet it on its own ground." As we led Denham out into the fog and into Lestrade's waiting custody, he turned one last time toward Holmes. "You think you've won," he hissed, "but truth is not justice. Remember that, Holmes. Some crimes live forever." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Perhaps, but not unchallenged." and as the police led Denham away into the mist, I saw in Holmes's eyes that peculiar mixture of triumph and melancholy that followed his greatest victories, when intellect triumphed, yet humanity had somehow lost. We said little on the way back to Baker Street, the city quiet around us. Only once, as we neared home, did Holmes speak again. "Watson," he said softly, "do you recall Mrs. Wilberforce's words? It's not the doors I fear, but the silence between them. She was right. Evil often hides not in noise, but in silence, in what we choose not to hear." And with that, he fell silent once more, the fog swallowing his words as London drifted into uneasy sleep. The carriage wheels murmured along Baker Street as dawn broke, pale and uncertain. The fog had thinned, leaving the air heavy with damp cold. I had dozed off for a brief moment during the ride, but when I opened my eyes, Holmes was already standing by the window of our sitting room, staring out at the awakening city. His coat was still on, his pipe unlit in his hand, a rare sign that his mind was not at ease. For a long while he said nothing. Then, without turning, he murmured, "He was right about one thing, Watson. Truth and justice are not always companions." I rose and poured him a cup of tea, setting it on the table beside him. "You speak of Denham. Who else?" he replied quietly. "A man of intellect wasted by moral decay. His cunning might have built an empire of reason, yet he chose to build only deception." I sipped my tea and regarded him. "Even so, he is behind bars now. The case is over." Holmes's gaze remained distant. "No, Watson, the case is paused, not concluded." Before I could question him further, a brisk knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice announced Inspector Lestrade. He entered, his hat in hand, and his expression unusually grave. "Holmes," he began, "we've a development. Denham's cell was found empty this morning." I shot to my feet. "Empty? Escaped?" Lestrade nodded. "It appears so. The guard swears he saw him asleep not an hour before, but when the warden checked at dawn, gone. No forced locks, no broken windows. Vanished as though he'd melted into air." Holmes turned sharply now, all lethargy gone. "Impossible. Scotland Yard's cells are designed for containment. Either someone within assisted him, or the man's ingenuity exceeds even my estimation." Lestrade sighed heavily. "The latter wouldn't surprise me. There's something else. You should see this." He handed Holmes a small envelope, its surface stained with soot. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single playing card, the E, Queen of Hearts, its face marked with a drop of crimson wax, and beneath it a line written in a firm, elegant hand. "A queen remains until the king has fallen." Holmes's brow furrowed. A message and a taunt. The queen in this instance must refer to Miss Finch, or perhaps to someone else entirely. Lestrade frowned. "Meaning what?" Holmes's voice sharpened. "Meaning Denham's game continues, and the true queen may yet be unseen upon the board." We wasted no time. Within the hour we were again in Lestrade's cab, rattling toward the Wilberforce residence. As we approached, I noticed movement near the gate, a figure in black, standing perfectly still beneath the morning haze. When the carriage stopped, Holmes was already out before the wheels had ceased turning. "Miss Finch?" he called softly. The figure turned. It was indeed Clara Finch, though her expression was ghostly pale. Her eyes, once anxious but gentle, now seemed hollow with sleepless terror. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "they said he was caught, safe, but this morning I received this." She handed him another note, trembling. It bore the same wax seal, the same intricate mark. Holmes read it swiftly. "One truth remains. You owe the past its due. Tonight, when the bell strikes 10, the sea will take what it is owed." Holmes folded the letter slowly. He intends to meet her again, or rather to lure her to her death. "But where?" I asked. "The clue is in his words," Holmes said. "The sea will take what it is owed. The lighthouse, Watson, the one near Blackridge Point, the site of the first inheritance scandal. Denham intends to end the circle where it began." Lestrade nodded grimly. "We'll have men there by nightfall." Holmes shook his head. "No. Denham anticipates force. We go quietly. Too many will spook him into flight." Clara's voice trembled. "You can't mean to take me there." Holmes turned to her gently. "No, Miss Finch, but I must ask you for one last favor. Denham believes he controls the end of this story. I intend to let him believe exactly that. That night, the fog rolled in heavy once again, cloaking the cliffs of Blackridge Point in a shroud of grey. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its beam slicing through the mist like a pale blade. Holmes and I approached on foot, keeping to the shadows, while Lestrade and his men waited a quarter-mile behind, ready to close the trap at Holmes's signal. Inside, the air smelled of salt and decay. Footsteps echoed faintly above, the sound of a man pacing. Holmes motioned for silence, then ascended the spiral staircase with cat-like precision. As we neared the upper chamber, we could see Denham, standing beside the great lamp, its turning light washing his face in alternating bands of shadow and brilliance. He was dressed impeccably once more, though his hair hung wild in the damp air. He held something in his hand, a photograph yellowed with age. "I knew you'd come," he said without turning. "You cannot resist a puzzle left unfinished." Holmes's voice was steady. "Your escape was audacious, but this is where it ends, Denham." Denham laughed softly. "Ends? No. You still don't see, do you, Holmes? I was never escaping. I was returning. This place holds my truth, not the courts, not the city. Here is where I buried it all." He turned then, and I saw that the photograph was of a young woman, the same face, unmistakably, as Clara Finch. Holmes stepped closer. "Eleanor Marlowe," he said quietly. "Her mother." Denham's eyes gleamed. "My sister," he said, "and my ruin. She betrayed me to the Wilberforces, took the last of what was mine. I did not kill for greed, Holmes. I killed for balance." "Balance?" Holmes repeated. "You took lives for a crime 2 decades old. There is no balance in vengeance." "Then you have learned nothing," Denham said sharply. "Truth demands balance, and tonight it will be restored." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for a fleeting instant I saw the struggle behind her eyes. The waves crashed below, thunderous and merciless. Then, slowly, she allowed herself to be drawn back from the edge. We returned to the village in silence. The innkeeper, startled by our arrival, brought blankets and tea. Clara said nothing as she sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, as though they held all the ghosts of her family. When dawn broke, she was still there, motionless but breathing, her face softened by exhaustion rather than despair. Holmes and I stood apart. "You reached her," I said quietly. "You saved her." He gave a faint shake of the head. "No, Watson. She saved herself. I merely held the line long enough for her to choose. By midday, we arranged for her to be taken to London under discreet care. Holmes insisted that no report be filed, no name mentioned. "Let this one pass quietly into history," he said. "The living deserve that mercy, at least." As we made our way back toward the station, I noticed Holmes seemed older somehow, as though the case had carved new lines of fatigue into his face. He walked slowly, his usual brisk energy subdued. "You look troubled," I ventured. He gave a wry smile. "A curious sensation, Watson, feeling that justice and mercy may not coexist. I have spent years chasing truth, believing it the highest pursuit. But what use is truth if it leaves only ruin in its wake?" I had no answer. When the train began its slow pull from the station, the sea receded behind us, its endless voice fading into the hum of the wheels. Holmes leaned back, eyes closed, as if retreating into some private recess of thought. The silver locket lay once again upon his knee, its clasp slightly open, revealing a miniature portrait of Eleanor Marlowe, stern, graceful and infinitely sad. He turned it over in his fingers, then closed it gently. "There are some mysteries, Watson," he said at last. "That should be left unsolved, not for lack of intellect, but out of compassion." Outside, the light shifted, and the landscape blurred once more into motion. London awaited us, indifferent as ever, ready to swallow one more tale of guilt and redemption into its endless streets. But as I watched Holmes sit in silence, the faint reflection of the sea still caught in his eyes. I knew that this case, unlike so many others, had marked him deeply. Perhaps, I thought, every great detective carries within him not just the hunger for truth, but the quiet sorrow of knowing that some truths are better left to the tide. The weeks following our return to Baker Street were curiously subdued. Holmes resumed his usual routines with the precision of habit. Consultations, monographs, and a few minor investigations that barely stirred his interest. Yet beneath the surface calm, I could sense the weight of something unresolved, a thought turning endlessly in the recesses of his mind. It was on a drizzly November morning when the matter reached its quiet conclusion. I found Holmes seated by the fire, pipe in hand, a single envelope resting unopened upon the arm of his chair. Its creamy paper bore the return address of a private asylum on the southern coast. Without a word, he slid it toward me. "Read it, Watson." The letter was brief and written by the head physician. "Mr. Holmes, it may comfort you to know that Miss Clara Finch is recovering steadily. Though her memories of the incident remain clouded, her constitution grows stronger each day. She speaks occasionally of you and Dr. Watson, always with gratitude. She has taken to gardening in our courtyard and seems at peace for the first time since her arrival. Yours respectfully, Dr. Lionel Corbett." I looked up. "That is good news, surely." Holmes gave a faint nod, though his expression remained unreadable. "Peace, yes, but at what price?" "She has lost the sharpness of mind that made her both victim and survivor. In forgetting, she has found freedom." He rose then, pacing before the hearth. "And yet the facts of the case remain. We untangled the lies, but one truth eluded even me until recently. Tell me, Watson, do you recall the peculiar engraving upon the locket she returned to me?" I thought for a moment. "Her crest, yes, an anchor intertwined with a serpent." "Precisely," said Holmes, his eyes brightening. "At first I assumed it to be a mere family emblem, but after consulting the records at the Herald's office, I found it matched the insignia of the old Blythe Shipping Company, which dissolved nearly 20 years ago following allegations of smuggling. Its founder, Reginald Blythe, vanished without trace, until, that is, I compared a faded portrait to one in Eleanor Marlowe's sitting room. Her late husband, you recall, was said to have died abroad." I stared at him. "You mean to say?" "The Marlowe family fortune was built on illicit trade, and Reginald Blythe reinvented himself under another name. When Eleanor discovered the truth, likely through Clara's father, she was driven to silence all who knew it. Hence the web of fear that consumed them. The old woman's cry at midnight, as the villagers described it, was no ghostly echo but Clara's own voice trapped between loyalty and guilt." He paused, tapping his pipe against the grate. "It was not vengeance that haunted that house, Watson. It was conscience, handed down like an heirloom. The sins of the father revisited the children, until the last of them sought absolution in the sea. For a moment, the room was utterly still, save for the crackle of the fire. Then Holmes sank back into his chair, a weariness softening his features. "There is a curious justice in it all," he murmured. "The law punishes the deed, but time punishes the soul. In this instance, I believe the latter was far the harsher." I regarded him quietly. "And yet, Holmes, you gave her a chance to live. You may call it fate or conscience, but you stopped her from joining her family's ghosts." He looked at me then, a faint smile curving at the edge of his mouth. "Perhaps even I grow sentimental in my advancing years. Or perhaps, Watson, I have learned that logic, though the servant of truth must sometimes bow to mercy." Outside, the rain had softened to a mist, and the city's noises drifted faintly through the fog. Hooves upon cobblestones, a vendor's distant cry, the hum of life that continued heedless of human tragedy. Holmes reached for his violin, its varnished surface gleaming in the firelight. He drew the bow gently across the strings, and a slow, haunting melody filled the room. It was unlike his usual restless improvisations. This was tender, almost mournful, as though he played not for himself, but for the lost souls of Blackridge. When the final note faded, he set the instrument aside. "The sea has claimed its secrets," he said softly. "Let it keep them." That evening, as I prepared my notes, I found myself reflecting upon all that had transpired. Holmes had, as ever, unmasked deceit and restored order, yet this case had touched him more deeply than most. Perhaps it was the frailty of Clara Finch's courage, or the bitter symmetry of inherited guilt, but something human, something almost melancholy had brushed the edges of his reason. Later, when I looked up from my writing, Holmes was standing at the window, gazing into the fog-wrapped streets below. His silhouette was still almost statuesque, the faint ember of his pipe glowing like a solitary beacon in the dimness. "You're thinking of the case," I said quietly. He gave a small nod without turning. "No, Watson, merely listening." "To what?" "To the echoes of the sea." And with that he fell silent once more, So ended the affair of the cry of the old woman at midnight, a case that tested not only Holmes's intellect, but the limits of his compassion. For once, even I could not decide whether we had triumphed or merely borne witness to the inevitable reckoning of a haunted past. Yet as I closed my notebook and the lamps dimmed, I could not help but feel that somewhere upon some distant shore, the cries that once pierced the fog had at last fallen quiet. He turned toward the staircase, and for the first time I saw the faint glint of a pistol in his coat. Holmes moved like lightning, lunging forward, knocking the weapon aside as it discharged. The shot echoed through the chamber, glass shattering, the great lamp flaring wildly. I rushed to assist, grappling with Denham as the light began to spin out of control. In the struggle, Denham slipped, his foot catching the edge of the platform. For an instant he hung there, framed against the sea's black void below, his face twisted not with fear but with defiance. "Tell her," he gasped, "the debt is paid." And before either of us could move, he let go. The sound of the waves swallowing him was distant, almost merciful. Holmes stood motionless for several seconds, his gaze fixed on the place where Denham had vanished. When at last he spoke, his voice was soft. Even in death he chose his ending. Perhaps that was all he ever sought. We remained in silence as dawn crept across the cliffs, the lighthouse beam dimming at last. When we descended to the shore, Lestrade's men found no trace of Denham's body, only the shattered fragments of the lamp glass scattered like tears across the rocks. Holmes looked out over the grey horizon. "Some cases end with justice, Watson," he said. "Others simply with truth. And truth in its purest form is seldom kind." He turned from the sea, his coat whipping in the wind, and we walked back toward the path, the waves breaking endlessly against the stones, as if the sea itself mourned the man it had taken. The sea wind cut through the morning mist as Holmes and I made our way back to London, the carriage wheels clattering over the rough, damp road. Holmes remained silent most of the journey, his expression unreadable. The faint light of dawn caught the sharp planes of his face, revealing no triumph, only a deep and private melancholy. I knew him well enough not to interrupt. Whatever satisfaction might be found in Denham's demise was tainted by the knowledge that truth, once uncovered, often left ruin in its wake. It was past 9 when we arrived once more at Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, ever watchful, took one look at us and wordlessly set out tea and bread. Holmes neither ate nor spoke, but went straight to his desk, spreading Denham's letters and notes across its surface. The photograph of Eleanor Marlowe, Clara's mother, lay atop the pile. For a long while Holmes stared at it in silence. "Watson," he said finally, "we stand at the edge of understanding, yet I cannot shake the sense that a final shadow remains. You believe Denham's death was not the end?" He tapped a finger against the photograph. "No," his words before he fell, "tell her the debt is paid." They were not the confession of a man at peace. They were a message, and if he meant what I suspect, Miss Finch may not yet be free of this affair. I frowned. But surely she was merely a bystander, a victim of circumstance. "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, "but the truth seldom grants innocence so easily." He rose abruptly. "We must speak with her again. And this time, Watson, I fear we must ask questions she would rather not answer. When we arrived at Clara Finch's small lodging near Kensington, we found her pale and agitated, pacing by the window. She started when we entered, clutching a small locket in her hand. "Mr. Holmes, doctor, thank heavens you've come," she said breathlessly. "I read in the morning papers about what happened at the lighthouse. They said Mr. Denham died, but—" Her voice faltered. "I keep hearing things. Footsteps outside, voices in the hall. I haven't slept." Holmes regarded her keenly. "Fear can play cruel tricks upon the mind, Miss Finch, but it can also sharpen memory. Tell me, did Denham ever speak to you of your mother?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering downward. "He mentioned her once, long ago. Said she was the only person who could have saved him. I thought it was nonsense, he was so bitter about the past." Holmes's gaze narrowed slightly. "And yet you carry her likeness still." She looked at the locket in her trembling hand. "It was the only thing I had of hers. She died when I was a child. My father never spoke of her again." Holmes stepped closer, his tone measured. "Do you know how she died?" A tear escaped her. "They said it was an accident, a fall near the cliffs, but—" She drew a shuddering breath. "Denham used to say it was no accident, that she took something from him, a document, a confession, and that she paid for it with her life. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "And where were you then, Miss Finch?" "I was barely 6. I remember only the sea, the sound of the bell in the distance, and my mother crying. She told me to run. So I did." Her voice broke into a whisper. "When I turned back, she was gone." Holmes's voice softened, but his eyes gleamed with focus. "You said she took something from him, a document. Did he ever describe it?" She shook her head. "Only that it could destroy him. That it carried a name, a date, and a promise broken." Holmes turned away, deep in thought. "A document that survived 20 years. Or perhaps not." He looked suddenly toward her small writing desk. "May I?" Without waiting for her answer, he opened the drawer. Inside lay a folded scrap of yellowed paper, brittle with age. Clara gasped. "I didn't put that there." Holmes unfolded it carefully. The writing was Denham's, recognizably firm. With the same flourish I had seen on his earlier notes, Eleanor kept her word. "The sea shall bear witness when I cannot. The bell tolls for those who forget their debt." Beneath it, a faint watermark appeared, the emblem of a law firm long defunct, Marlowe and Trent, solicitors of Blackridge. "Watson," Holmes murmured, "this proves it." Eleanor had the document in her possession before she died, and Denham, despite his claims, never found it. "Which means—" "That someone else did," I finished. Holmes's eyes darted toward Clara. "And that someone has placed this note here deliberately, to draw us back to the scene of her mother's death." Before we could say more, a sudden pounding at the door startled us all. Lestrade burst in, his face ashen. "Holmes, you'll not believe this, but Denham's body has been found." "Found?" Holmes's voice was low. "Where?" "Dragged up this morning by the tide near Blackridge Point. But here's the devilish thing, he's been dead less than 12 hours. I stared at him. "That's impossible." "He fell 2 nights ago." "Impossible or not, it's fact," Lestrade said grimly. "And there's more. The coroner says the fall didn't kill him. He was drowned." Holmes's face was unreadable, though his fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "Then we are dealing not with an ending, Watson, but with a resurrection of sorts. Denham did not fall to his death. He was taken afterward. Clara had gone white as chalk." "Taken? By whom?" Holmes looked at her gravely. "That, Miss Finch, is what we must determine. But there is something you must understand. The person who left this note, who placed that card and now returns Denham to the sea, wishes us to believe the cycle is complete." "I suspect it is not." Lestrade frowned. "You mean someone's still playing his game?" Holmes picked up the photograph once more and studied it under the light. "No, Lestrade. Someone else was always part of it. Denham was never the mastermind, only the hand that moved first. The true author of this story remains hidden." He turned suddenly to Clara. "You must leave London at once. Stay with friends. Tell no one where you go. But why?" "Because," Holmes said softly, "the cry we heard that night at Belgrave Street was not only your grandmother's. It was a warning that the past was not finished with your family. Whoever stands behind these events believes you still hold what Denham sought. Until we find them, you are not safe." Clara clutched the locket to her chest, eyes wide with terror. "Then find them, Mr. Holmes, please, before the sea comes for me, too." Holmes said nothing. He merely nodded, then turned to the window, his silhouette framed by the pale, misted light of morning. I could sense his mind already racing ahead, following threads that only he could see. After a long silence, he said in a low voice, "Watson, fetch your coat. We are going back to Blackridge Point." And though the day was just beginning, I felt as though the shadows of night had only grown darker. The journey back to Blackridge Point was a grim one. The day had not yet brightened. Clouds pressed low upon the horizon, and the steady drumming of rain against the carriage roof echoed the unease that had settled between us. Holmes sat opposite me, motionless, his hat pulled low and his eyes half hidden in shadow. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was the only sound for miles until he spoke, his tone low and reflective. "Watson," he began, "there is a peculiar symmetry to this affair. 3 generations bound by deceit, each believing they hold the truth. Yet every truth we uncover gives birth to another lie." I nodded, though my mind was heavy with confusion. "And you believe this final journey will expose it?" He smiled faintly. "No, my dear fellow, I believe it will end it. When we reached the coast, the wind had grown fierce. The sea, grey and wild, hurled itself upon the rocks below the cliff. sending up bursts of white spray that vanished into mist. The lighthouse, its glass shattered from the previous night's struggle, stood silent and lifeless. Lestrade and 2 constables waited near the base, their lanterns bobbing weakly against the gloom. Holmes wasted no time. He began inspecting the narrow path that wound down toward the water, his keen eyes sweeping every inch. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "the tide has turned, but the sea never forgets what it has taken. Somewhere upon this shore lies the key Denham sought, and the reason someone made certain he never lived to find it." We followed him down the slippery rocks, the roar of the surf nearly drowning our words. At a sheltered point beneath the cliff, where the tide had only just receded, Holmes halted. He knelt and brushed aside a layer of wet sand, revealing the faint outline of a small rusted box. "There," he murmured. "Eleanor's promise. With Lestrade's help, we pried it open. Inside lay a waterlogged bundle of papers, bound with a ribbon long since frayed." Holmes lifted it with great care, examining the faded ink under his lantern. "A legal document," he said, "bearing the same seal as Marlowe and Trent, and here the date, March 18th, 1856, the year of the Wilberforce inheritance dispute." Lestrade frowned. "But what does it prove?" Holmes spread the papers upon a flat stone. "Everything. This document reveals that Denham's claim was not false at all. He was the rightful heir to the estate, but the court never saw this evidence. It was hidden by Eleanor Marlowe herself. She protected her daughter, Clara, by destroying her brother's rights. I felt a chill run through me despite the cold. Then Denham's vengeance was born of betrayal," Holmes finished quietly. "He sought only to reclaim what was his, but his sister's silence destroyed him. The irony, Watson, is that she acted not from malice but from fear. Denham had already killed once, to obtain proof of his legitimacy. She believed by hiding it she could end his violence. Instead, she ensured it would continue." As he spoke, the wind howled louder, and I thought I saw movement at the top of the cliff. Holmes's head turned sharply. "We are not alone." A moment later, a figure emerged through the mist, holding a pistol steady in trembling hands. Clara Finch stood above us, her dress soaked by rain, her face pale as death. "Don't come closer," she cried. "I had to know. You found it, didn't you?" "My mother's secret." Holmes raised a calming hand. "Miss Finch, put the weapon down. You do not understand what you are holding." "I understand perfectly," she shouted, her voice breaking. "All my life I thought I was free of this curse, but it was mine from the beginning, wasn't it? My mother lied, my uncle murdered, and now you all want to drag me into their sins." "No one wishes you harm," Holmes said gently, stepping closer. "But you are mistaken about one thing. The document your mother hid, she did it to protect you. You are the heir now, Miss Finch. The estate, the fortune, all of it passes to you. Denham's death changes nothing." Her eyes flickered, torn between disbelief and despair. "You're lying," she whispered. Holmes's tone hardened. "I do not lie. But if you fire that weapon, you will only ensure that their legacy ends in blood." For a long moment she stood frozen, the pistol wavering. The wind roared, waves crashing against the rocks below. Then her shoulders sagged, and she let the weapon fall, collapsing to her knees. I hurried forward, taking her arm. While Lestrade retrieved the gun, she wept quietly, her voice lost in the wind. "I never wanted any of this. I only wanted it to stop." Holmes looked down at her, the lantern light flickering across his face. "And now it can. The truth, however cruel, is the only way to end such a chain. We brought her back to London that evening. Lestrade handled the matter with discretion. Clara was not charged, though she remained under close watch. The newspapers printed a brief and inaccurate account of Denham's death, an accident. They called it, as though such tragedies could ever be so simple. It was not until several days later, as we sat again before the fire at Baker Street, that Holmes finally spoke of it. The box lay open on the table, the documents drying beside it. He stared into the flames, the orange glow dancing in his sharp grey eyes. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is a curious cruelty in justice. It restores balance but seldom peace." I leaned back in my chair. "You believe Miss Finch will never find peace?" "I believe none of them ever did," he replied. "Eleanor hid the truth and lost her life. Denham found it and lost his soul. And Clara, poor girl, has inherited both their burdens. She will live, yes, but the echoes of this crime will never leave her." I watched him carefully. "And you, Holmes? Does it leave you unsettled as well?" He smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "My dear Watson, I am not built for peace, only for understanding." Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft and endless against the windows. The clock upon the mantel struck 12, and for a moment the sound carried me back to that terrible night, the cry that had started it all. The cry of an old woman at midnight, a sound that had drawn us into the tangled web of grief and vengeance that bound 3 generations. Holmes rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He took the locket we had found among Clara's things, the one containing her mother's likeness, and placed it gently atop the documents. Then, in a rare gesture of sentiment, he said softly, "Let the sea keep its secrets now, Watson. We've pried enough ghosts from the deep." And with that he turned away, the firelight flickering across his profile as the fog of London thickened beyond the window. I realized, not for the first time, that the world would never truly know the man who stood before me, this strange guardian of logic in a city haunted by mysteries. For though Sherlock Holmes had once again uncovered the truth, it was the old woman's cry that lingered longest in my memory, a sound not of fear but of release, a voice carried away by the tide, leaving behind only silence and the faintest trace of peace in its wake. Several weeks passed before Holmes spoke of the matter again, and by then the fog that had shrouded London during those dreadful days had lifted, leaving the city bright and deceptively calm. Yet even as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Baker Street, I could sense that the case still lingered in Holmes's thoughts. There was something unfinished in his manner, an invisible thread he continued to tug at in silence. Had nearly convinced myself that the affair of Eleanor, Marlowe and her ill-fated kin was concluded, when a small envelope arrived one morning, its seal bearing the faint imprint of a coastal parish crest. Holmes turned it over in his long fingers, eyes narrowing slightly. Without a word, he slit it open. A small silver locket fell onto the table, along with a folded note written in an elegant, uncertain hand. Holmes read it once, then twice, before handing it to me. "Mr. Holmes, you told me the truth brings peace, but peace has not come. I return this to you because it no longer belongs to me. The sea keeps calling, and I fear I must go where it leads. Tell Dr. Watson not to grieve for what cannot be saved." Clara Finch, my hand trembled slightly as I set the letter down. "Good heavens, Holmes. You think she means—" He did not answer at once. Instead, he rose, crossed to the window, and looked out upon the busy street below, where carriages rattled past and vendors called out their wares, as though the world itself had not shifted beneath us. "At times," he said quietly, "truth releases one man and ensnares another. Miss Finch has inherited her family's curse, not of blood but of conscience. She cannot live with what she knows, but surely we can stop her if we go to the coast, if we warn the authorities." He shook his head slowly. "If she has already written this, Watson, then she is far beyond reach. Still, I mean to follow. Some part of me refuses to believe that she is lost." By dusk that same day, we were on the evening train to the coast. Holmes sat silent the entire journey, his eyes fixed upon the shifting blur of the countryside. The rhythm of the wheels seemed to echo the unspoken question between us. Was this pursuit an act of rescue or requiem? We arrived at Blackridge just past midnight. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the salt and chill of the sea. The village slept uneasily under a half-moon, its narrow lanes glistening with rain. The innkeeper, who remembered us from our previous visit, confirmed our fears. Miss Finch had arrived 2 days prior, alone, and had taken a room overlooking the cliffs. No one had seen her since morning. Holmes's expression grew graver still. "We must go now, Watson. Bring the lantern." We made our way toward the cliff path, the same jagged trail where the first tragedy had begun. The air was heavy with mist, and the faint sound of the tide rose from below like a distant voice. Halfway along, Holmes paused. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a faint glow ahead. Through the drifting fog, I saw the outline of a figure standing near the edge, a lantern set beside her feet. Her hair blew wildly in the wind. Her face, turned toward the sea, was pale in the moonlight. Clara Finch stood upon the precipice, her posture calm yet utterly resigned. "Miss Finch," I called out, my voice breaking against the roar of the wind. "Come back. It isn't too late." She did not turn. Instead, she spoke softly, almost as though to herself. "Do you hear it, Dr. Watson? The sea never forgets. It has taken all of them, and now it's calling me. Holmes stepped forward, his tone steady but low, as though he were soothing a frightened child. Clara, listen to me. The dead are gone. They do not call for you. The burden you bear belongs to the past. Her voice trembled. No, Mr. Holmes, the past is the burden. For a terrible moment I thought she would step forward, but Holmes's hand shot out, catching her wrist. The movement was quick, desperate and human in a way I had seldom seen from him. The lantern fell, its flame extinguished by the damp air. Enough, he said, his voice rough with something between command and plea. If you go to the sea tonight, it will take nothing but another innocent life. You cannot redeem the dead by joining them.